Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of written record that we have. A clay disc smaller than your hand sits behind glass in the British Museum, and it should not exist. The sky carved into. It does not match the kingdom that made it. It does not match the empire that copied it. It matches a night thousands of years older than the first Sumerian city. A night before writing, before kings, before the first ledger was ever pressed into mud. It has an inscription in uniform, the oldest form of writing that was used around 3400 BC, and the 8 measurements scratched across its surface are not prayers. They are tracking data. Somebody on a date older than civilization watched something terrible cross the heavens and wrote it down. The disc that should not exist. The artifact has a quiet British museum. Catalogue number K 8538. You can walk past it in room 55 and never know what you are looking at. Roughly 14 centimeters across, small enough to hold in one hand, one side carved into 8 wedge-shaped segments like a pie. Chart pressed into wet clay nearly 3,000 years ago. Most uniform tablets from this era beg the gods for harvests or kings or favorable wars. This one does something else. It measures star positions logged against known constellations, angular data of the kind. A navigator would use rising and setting times given to a precision that serves no ritual purpose at all, and buried in several segments, numerical sequences that describe not just where something is in the sky, but where it is, going at what angle and at what speed. It reads like an instrument logger, flight recorder pressed into mud. Henry Leard pulled it out of the ground in the 1850s. Picture him there for a moment. A Victorian Englishman in heavy wool, standing knee-deep in the dust of Nineveh in the heat of an Iraqi summer, surrounded by trenches and broken brick, while local workers haul tablets out of collapsed shelving by the thousand. Most went into crates, most were never read. This one made it into the case in London, and there it has remained while the world walked past. Sir Austin Henry Leard, born in the year 1817, and he was in northern Iraq, and there he helped to uncover the ancient Assyrian cities Nin and Nimrod, and there were found relics and statues of bulls and lions, and on thousands of clay tablets on which in the language cuneiform. The clay dates to roughly 700 BCE CE, the height of the Assyrian Empire under King Ashurbanipal. But here is the problem. The clay is one age, the data carved into it is something else entirely. The night that predates writing. Modern astronomy software can rewind the heavens. Stars drift slowly but predictably century by century through a wobble called precession. Feed enough star positions into the right program, and the program will tell you to the night when that exact sky existed. It is the kind of thing professional astronomers used to plan observations and historians used to date eclipses in old chronicles. So somebody fed the planisphere into one. The configuration on the tablet does not match 700 BCE. It does not match 1000 BCE or 1500. Before the Common Era or 2000 before the Common Era. The match the software returned was a specific night, roughly 2,400 years before the tablet itself was even shaped. The date is June 29, the 3123 BCE. Nobody should have that data. Think about what that means for a second. That is older than the oldest Sumerian city we have any written record of. It is older than form. It is older than writing in any form at all. Whoever made the original observation was watching the sky in a world before the first ledger, before the first king list, before the first scribe ever pressed a reed into mud and called it language. And yet, someone standing somewhere on the plain between two rivers recorded that exact summer night with enough accuracy that more than 5,000 years later, laptop could match it to within hours. Picture them. A figure on a rooftop or a riverbank in the pre-dawn dark. No. Telescope, no paper. Some scratch marks. On bone or clay or wood we no longer have, watching something cross the sky. That was important enough to write down, in a world that did not yet know how to write. What were they looking at? The two men who read it like engineers. 2008. London. Two researchers named Alan Bond and Mark Hempel publish a book arguing. They finally know. Bond is an aerospace engineer, grey-haired, quiet, the kind of man who has spent a working life inside the dense math of rocket propulsion he has put decades into. Engine designs for spacecraft. Hempel is a spacecraft systems engineer who has worked with the European Space Agency. They are not Assyriologists. They are not classists. They are men who, for a living, read trajectory data the way you read a road sign. When the planisphere lands in front of them, they do not see religion. They do not see omen literature. They see a worksheet. Hemphill later described the moment of recognition. Alan knew that I enjoyed this sort of hobby project as much as he did, and further my research at the university at the time was looking at global catastrophe events, so he asked if I would be interested in joining him, and of course I said yes please. The two of them sitting with photographs and a translation of the ununiform. Working through the segments one at a time, the way you work through any technical document, and somewhere in the second or third segment, the pattern resolves, the numbers stop. Being abstract, they start describing motion. A single object observed 8 times plotted against the fixed stars as it moves across the sky. The shape of the data is unmistakable to anyone who has spent their career staring at it. Bond, the older of the two, the man whose working life has been rocket, motors and orbital mechanics, says the obvious thing. This is not astrology. This is tracking, if stories, where the academic establishment quietly looks the other way are the reason you are here. Hit subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this channel digging into the things mainstream documentaries refuse to touch. Now back to what the engineers found. What Bond and Hemphill saw the moment they understood the structure of the 8 segments was not a star map in the religious sense at all. It was a tracking log, a single moving body observed at 8 separate moments plotted against the fixed stars as it crossed the sky. The kind of record you produce when you are watching something that does not belong up there. And once you have 8 points, you can draw a line. Think about what that means for a moment. 2 engineers working in the 21st century looked at a disk made before the rise of Rome and recognized the math because they used that same math to put rockets into orbit. So they did what any engineer would do. They projected the line forward. The trajectory points somewhere specific. The path begins high. The object enters the atmosphere at a shallow angle. The kind of approach that produces a long, slow glowing streak rather than a sudden flash. It crosses the eastern Mediterranean, still riding high. It passes the northern coastlines and continues inland, descending the whole way slow enough to be tracked, bright enough to read by visible from horizon to horizon for anyone awake and looking up. Picture it from the rooftop of a mud brick settlement on the Tigris floodplain. A line of fire crawling across the pre-dawn sky west to northwest, brighter than the moon, slow enough that you could mark its position against the star run inside. Come back out and mark it again. That is the kind of object the planisphere is describing, not a meteor. Meteors flash and vanish in a heartbeat. This thing was up there long enough to be measured 8 times, and then the numbers run out. Wherever the line ends is where the object either struck the ground or exploded in the air above it. The line ends in the Austrian Alps, more specifically in a narrow valley in the Austrian Tyrol called Kuffels. You have probably never heard of Kuffels. There are no tourist signs, no streaming documentaries. But here is the problem. Kuffel is the site of one of the largest prehistoric landslides in all of Europe, possibly the largest in the entire Alps. Kuffel is one of the most geologically unusual places in Europe. It is the site of one of the largest prehistoric landslides on the continent. Roughly 9 kilometers of mountain came apart in a single event and filled the valley floor. Take every high-rise in Manhattan, crush them into rubble, and you would have a fraction of a percent of the material involved. Geologists have studied that deposit for over a century. They have dated it, they have argued about it, and on one fundamental point, they have never agreed. Nobody can explain what caused it. The mountain that came apart, and the question nobody wants to ask. Normal landslide mechanics break down at Kuffel. The volume is too large for ordinary slope failure. There is no clean seismic fault running through the area. Groundwater saturation. The usual culprit in smaller collapses does not scale to 9 cubic kilometers of rock shearing off a mountain in a single episode. And then there is the melted rock. Scattered through the Kuffel's deposit are pieces of stone that were heated during the event to temperatures high enough to partially liquefy them before cooling back into deformed shapes. The existence of this material is not in dispute. Its cause is. Some specialists argue friction from the moving rock could have done it. Others argue friction alone cannot account for the specific minology, and that something else, something hotter and faster was involved. That something else is an airburst, a detonation in the sky above the valley, a pressure wave combined with a thermal pulse, powerful enough to destabilize the slope and hot enough to glaze stone. You already know the modern reference point. Tunguska, Siberia, 1908. An incoming object exploded in the atmosphere and flattened roughly 800 square miles of forest without leaving a crater. Trees laid down like matchsticks. all of them pointing away from a single empty spot in the sky. No fragments to recover, just devastation, with nothing in the middle of it. Kofil, if the airburst model is right, would have been larger, possibly significantly larger. The kind of event that does not just flatten a forest, the kind of event that takes a mountain off the map. And the line drawn by two aerospace engineers projected forward from a clay disk copied in the Assyrian library and originally observed in a world before Sumer ends precisely there. But here's the problem. If the trajectory ends at Kofil's, then somebody had to be alive to watch the object that caused it. If the bow shock breaks down, then the energy heats the body, not the air. And this happens very suddenly, leading to an explosion or an airburst. And that somebody was not Assyrian, not Babylonian, not even Sumerian in the strict sense. They lived before all of it, a copy of a copy of a copy, if Bond and Hemphill are right. The tablet in room 55 is not an original observation. It is the last surviving link in a chain. Imagine the chain. June 29th, 3123 BCEE. A figure stands on the plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates in the dark hour before dawn. Ununiform, does not exist yet. The Sumerian city-states have not been founded. The wheel is barely a rumor. Whatever they use to record the moment is some preiterate medium. Tokens, scratches, paint on bone. The kind of artifact that does not survive to be excavated. Their name is gone. Their face is gone. What they recorded is not. That figure watches a long, slow streak of light cross the sky from one horizon toward the other. They mark its position 8 times. They calculate in whatever proto-mathematics they have where it is going. Then the light reaches the Alps and the world shutters. The record is preserved. Generations later, someone in the early Sumerian period translates it into proto-uniform. Generations after that, someone copies the ununiform forward. The Sumerian city-states rise and fall. The Akkadian Empire rises and collapses. The Babylonians replace them. The Assyrians replace the Babylonians. Languages reform. Scripts are abandoned and rewritten. Empires burn each other's libraries down. And through all of it, this one specific observation log keeps getting copied. Sumerian scribes pass it to Adian scribes. Adian scribes pass it to Babylonian scribes. Babylonian scribes pass it to Assyrian scribes. None of them almost certainly knew exactly what they were carrying. They only knew generation after generation that this particular record was not allowed to be lost. That is not an accident. Ashurbanipal, the king who ultimately gave the tablet its final home, did not assemble his library by chance. He sent agents across the ancient Near East with explicit instructions to bring back the oldest, rarest, and most significant texts they could find. The library at Nineveh was a deliberate act of civilizational memory. It was the place where Mesopotamia kept what Mesopotamia could not afford to forget. And Ashurbanipal's curators kept this, a small clay disc from a sky no living person had seen, copied from a Sumerian-era observation that itself copied something older still. Why preserve a record that long? The obvious answer is the only honest one. The library at Nineveh was a copying factory. Ashurbanipal, who built it, was collecting tablets from all over the Assyrian Empire and having them copied. The event being described was the kind of thing a civilization does not forget. It gets witnessed, it gets recorded, it gets copied generation after generation, because forgetting it would feel like a kind of betrayal of the people who saw it. The silence from the experts. Bond and Hemphill's book was published by a small academic press with a peer review process. Their methodology is laid out on the page. The star position calculations, the dating, the trajectory reconstruction, all of it is open to checking. You do not have to take their word. You can take their numbers, plug them into a free planetarium program, and watch the match light up on your screen. So what happened next? Nothing. That is what happened. The academic response was not a rebuttal. It was a shrug. The book got described in passing as speculative as fringe, as the kind of thing serious Assyriology does not need to engage with. But here's the problem. Nobody published a counter-calculation showing that the star positions match a different date. Nobody published an alternative trajectory analysis showing that Bond and Hemphill drew the wrong line through the data. Nobody published a better explanation for the Koful's landslide that accounts for the volume, the melted rock, and the geology more convincingly than an airburst. Bond went back to his rocket engines. Heal went back to his spacecraft systems. The book stayed on the shelf where it has stayed for nearly 2 decades, and in the years since the question has not gotten smaller, it has gotten larger. Because every additional year of academic silence is another year in which nobody has been willing to actually do the work. The argument was not answered, it was ignored. There is a difference. And the difference matters. Science moves forward by refuting specific claims with specific evidence, not by deciding in advance which claims are respectable enough to merit a response. Dismissal by label is not the same thing as disproof by analysis. The planisphere is still in room 55. The landslide is still in the troll. The date June 29th. 3123 BCE is still the only specific answer anyone has produced to the question of what the tablet is recording. And the question of what an unknown observer watched cross the Sumerian sky on that specific morning is still open. But the trajectory still points to Kofels, and that is where the real problem begins. What the evidence forces you to consider. 2 aerospace engineers working from a Mesopotamian disk drew a line out of the ancient sky and onto a modern map. The line ends at a valley where a mountain came apart for reasons no geologist has ever fully explained. The melted rock is real. The 9 cubic kilometers of displaced material are real. The astronomical match with 3123 BCE is real. The deliberate multi-millennial preservation of the record by Ashurbanipal's scribes is real. Now, these conclusions were so certain and so important that I pretty much insisted that we should make the results public, which is not Alan's normal practice with his hobby projects. Each of these facts, standing alone, is curious. Together they are something else. The planisphere of Nineveh contains stellar data that matches a night before writing existed. The tablet was preserved and copied into the most important library in the ancient world, a library specifically curated to keep what the ancient world could not afford to lose. The observations on it, read by 2 engineers trained in exactly this kind of math, describe a tracked object on a calculable path. That path arrives at a place where a geological event of exactly the kind the path predicts occurred in roughly the right window with no other agreed cause. That is not proof. It is something harder. It is a pattern that nobody in nearly 2 decades since the book was published has been able to take apart, and in any other field. A pattern that strong would be the starting point for serious investigation, not the ending point for polite dismissal. So here is the sentence that has never appeared on a museum placard. The sentence missing from every documentary, every survey textbook, every popular treatment of Mesopotamian astronomy. This may be the only surviving eyewitness record of a catastrophic asteroid event in human history. Maybe it is not. Determining which would require taking Bond and Hemsel's numbers seriously, running the calculations again under independent observatory conditions, and either confirming the match or showing the field on the page exactly where it breaks down. That work has not been done in any publicly accessible peer-reviewed form. The tablet sits in its case in London. The book sits in libraries. The software runs on any laptop. A graduate student with a free afternoon could in principle settle the question. The calculation is waiting. The tablet is still in room 55. Picture the artifact one last time. 14 centimeters of clay, 8 segments of sky from before the first Sumerian city, copied forward by scribes who never knew what they were carrying. A trajectory that points across the Mediterranean, across the Alps, into a valley where a mountain came down for reasons science still cannot agree on. The figure on the rooftop in 3123 BCE is gone. The Sumerian scribes who first translated the marks into proto-uniform are gone. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians who copied it forward, all gone. Henry Lerard is gone. Ashurbanipal is dust. Bond and Hemsel put their book on the shelf almost 2 decades ago, and the shelf has for the most part stayed shut, but the tablet is still there, the valley is still there. The line between them is still there. And the question of what an anonymous observer watched cross the Sumerian sky on the dawn of June 29th, 3123 BCE is still formally unanswered. Now here is the question worth leaving with. Should the planisphere of Nineveh have its calculations rerun by a modern observatory in public on the record once and for all? Drop your answer in the comments. If you want more stories the mainstream documentaries quietly refuse to touch, hit like and subscribe, and the next one will be in your feed before you know it. The tablet is in room 55. The valley is in the tier. The sky from 3123 BCEE is still up there waiting for somebody to look at it.